On the 24th of February 2022, the military of the Russian Federation launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, marking the largest conventional conflict in Europe since the end of the Second World War. According to Putin, their aims were simple: demilitarize, denazify, and liberate Ukraine from the neo-fascist clutches of NATO and the West. They estimated that Kyiv would fall in 3 days at most, that President Volodymyr Zelensky would flee, and the Ukrainians would simply welcome their Russian comrades with open arms. Fast forward 10 months, and the drive to capture Kyiv failed after 5 weeks. The flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet was sunk, and now over 100,000 Russian soldiers are dead. Russia still does not fully control territory it's annexed, nor does it even fully control Donbass. You get the point. As winter sets in and the fronts come to a grinding halt, we need to ask ourselves, what went wrong for the second strongest army in the world? In this video, we'll be exploring why the Russian army has failed to achieve its objectives. We won't have time to analyze everything, so we'll look at some of the more obvious aspects, those being underestimation, command structure, and tactics. If you're wondering how this conflict even started, I did a series on the history of Ukraine that you can find on the top right. As ever, this took a while to make, so it would help a ton if you could drop a like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Without further ado, grab yourself some tea and let's delve in. As mentioned before, the Russian army expected Ukrainians to simply welcome them into their country. This assumption was so far accepted within the Russian government that plans for a coup d'etat against Zelensky were slated just a few days before the invasion. The war against Georgia in 2008 had seen the Russian army flood into the country, eliminating most major resistance. In contrast, the Chechen wars of 1995 and 1999 had proven the arrogance that plagued much of Russia. As Chechen rebels sought to gain independence from Russia, waves of poorly trained conscripts were sent into the Chechen capital of Grozny. In the end, well over 10,000 soldiers were killed, yet Russia claimed victory. But going toe-to-toe with a conventional military was something else entirely. The Ukrainian army had undergone significant modernization of its own between 2014 and 2022, not only in terms of weaponry but in training. Following the annexation of Crimea in 2014, the army increased to 200,000 by the next year, of which 75% were professionals. Existing stocks of tanks and equipment were upgraded with Western technology. For example, the workforce of many post-Soviet armies, the T-72, was outfitted with better parts like thermals and armor, whilst small arms such as the AK-47 were replaced with the more modern AK-74. These upgrades would provide a decisive edge in the battles to come. By 2022, the Ukrainian army was a completely different beast. It had not only grown in size and strength, but also through experience. After all, many of its soldiers had been fighting since 2014. Furthermore, Western countries had introduced NATO standard tactics to officers and soldiers, breeding a new class of capable, modern field officers and tacticians. Not only did the Russian army fail to realize this, but they also failed to realize just how committed the Ukrainian people were in defending both their homeland and democracy. Despite Putin's claims that Ukrainians and Russians were one and the same people, it took very little time for Ukraine to rally itself and put up a staunch defense. After all, it's far easier to convince people to defend their homeland than it is for an army to attack another. It's important to note the differences between the Russian command structure and Ukraine's, which is heavily based on NATO standards. The Russian system has changed little since the days of the Soviet Union, with a rigid chain of command and orders that cannot be disobeyed without direct permission. In the field, there is minimal autonomy, with soldiers expected to either carry out orders or die trying. This originates from an old Russian military tradition. Often there was a high level of mutual distrust between infantry and officer class, leading to tight command that prevented soldiers from doing anything that could be perceived as a threat. Such was observed in the 1905 Russo-Japanese War, where waves of soldiers were sent by both sides to assault well-entrenched positions, resulting in thousands of deaths for minimal gain. In comparison, Ukrainian strategy generally advocates for more autonomy and initiative, with units able to achieve objectives with flexibility based on the situation. As a pretty infamous example, the Russians repeatedly put helicopters and equipment at the airport of Chornobivka, near the city of Kherson. The Ukrainian army launched dozens of airstrikes on the airfield and eliminated a Russian general, dozens of helicopters and the whole battalion. This only stopped when the airfield was successfully recaptured on the 11th of November by Ukrainian forces. Recommendations to stop stockpiling equipment at the airfield had been simply ignored by the Russian upper brass. This brings us to tactics and organization. At the start of the invasion, Russia had around 150,000 soldiers, mostly organised into battalion tactical groups, or BTGs, each comprising about 600 soldiers. These were the bulk of the Russian forces and were designed to be versatile combat units, utilising a mixture of weapons including tanks, artillery and others. Yet it was apparent early on that lack of communication and planning was rampant. Just days after the invasion was launched, a 40-mile convoy intending to capture Kiev was halted and destroyed as supplies of fuel ran short. This is just one example of the inept organisation which has plagued Russian forces. Food rations have been found on soldiers that expired in 2015, whilst poorly maintained equipment like machine guns dating from World War I have been reported. This is really just the tip of the iceberg in the chaos that is Russia's logistics. Tactics have also changed drastically over the course of the war. During the initial stages, Russia relied extensively on overwhelming air power and artillery, but these were whittled down as Ukraine gained access to Western air defences and other weapons, especially HIMARS rocket launchers. Russia in turn has been targeting civil infrastructure, including power and water, in order to hamper ordinary life for civilians and destroy morale. As Russian air supremacy has largely been eliminated, inaccurate cruise missiles and drones imported from Iran have been used instead, yet even these are being lost at unsustainable rates. A war of attrition is not something that Russia expected nor really prepared for. The original plan was to seize Kiev and decapitate the Ukrainian government by eliminating its important figures, including President Zelensky, Commander-in-Chief Valery Zaluzhny and others. Since then, Russia's goals have been reduced time and time again, from forcing regime change to merely controlling Donbass and a few other oblasts. Manpower has also become an ever-pressing issue even after Putin's partial mobilization. More than half of the original invasion force has been killed, and Russia has been forced to rely more and more on irregular paramilitary groups, including the Wagner mercenary group. The Wagner group in particular has been in the headlines recently, due to their exploits around Bakhmut in the Donetsk Oblast, and their use of human wave tactics against well-entrenched Ukrainian forces which have led to heavy casualties. The emergence of parallel military forces during war is well recorded, particularly in the case of Nazi Germany, where the Waffen-SS gained greater influence than the Wehrmacht in the later years of the Second World War. For Ukraine, the priority was to blunt the initial Russian thrust. Once this was achieved, precision strikes against important targets such as supply dumps and command posts using HIMARS and artillery were carried out. These were accompanied by controlled counterattacks, with the most successful being the liberation of Kharkiv Oblast in September 2022 and the recapture of Kherson City in November. In recent weeks, calls have been given for better anti-air defences and Western tanks, including Leopards and Abrams. It's difficult to predict exactly how tactics will change, but it's likely that Russia will continue with costly human wave attacks and drone strikes against civilian infrastructure, whilst Ukraine will continue to operate cautiously. It's a well-known fact that Russia is incredibly corrupt, and that of course extends to the army. Since the invasion, reports of soldiers selling their tanks to Ukraine for money or bartering their weapons with locals for vodka has been pervasive. Institutionalized corruption has been a fact of life in Russian society for decades, but only until the armed forces were sent into Ukraine was the issue truly exposed. Military contracts for repairing and replacing equipment, including body armor and vehicles, were sold to poor quality firms or on the black market. In the field, it's not unusual for soldiers to be unpaid, and the extensive looting that has happened across the occupied territories is often for the sole profit of commanding officers. In comparison, Ukraine has started to clamp down on corruption both politically and militarily. Government programs dedicated to tracking Western weaponry have been set up, and officers accused of bribery and other forms of corruption have been sacked. Ukraine, however, is not without the same problems. The Foreign Legion, a unit composed of foreign volunteers set up by Zelensky, have faced allegations of corruption over the procurement and distribution of guns. Overall, the reasons for Russia's military failures so far are numerous, ranging from inept organisation to outdated tactics and beyond. For Ukraine, the road ahead remains dangerous. They keep a fragile upper hand, but just as Russia underestimated Ukraine, so too must Ukraine not underestimate Russia.
Slava Ukraine!
I hope you enjoyed this video. Once again, this took a while to make, so I'd greatly appreciate if you could like, comment and subscribe, as it does help a lot, algorithmically speaking. Have a good day, and I hope to see you in the next one.